Welcome, I'm Darren, and I'll be your guide today as I look at the Fleer Jam Session cards of the mid-1990s. Now, the Jam Session cards are a particular cut of card. They're a particular size of card that's referred to as a tallboy. And the tallboy has a not long and lustrous history. It's actually a very brief history, but it was a card design that had been done in the mid-1960s and then again right at the end of the 60s into the 70s. There were only 4 sets that had been created with it, and then it basically just disappeared. So this run of cards in the mid-90s was a really interesting kind of an ode back to these older cards, and also an opportunity to build something new out of that. So basketball is a natural place for these cards to reemerge. They did not reemerge from basketball. Basketball became kind of a secondary set off a football set called GameDay. But before I get into all that, I need to step back and kind of explain to you very briefly what these tall boys were. Tall boys are the dimensions of 2.5 inches by 4 and 11/16. Basically, it's a normal size card, but it's about a third, again, as tall. And like I said, it had been used in the mid-1960s for one hockey set and one football set, and then Topps didn't use it again until a couple years later when they dusted it off for basketball. Now, in the world of basketball, there had been very few sets that had been created, and I mean very few sets. Like by the year 1969, there had only been 2 professional sets. So for 69-70, this was a unique year for cards because it was kind of like that first Hall of Fame class. It was ridiculous how many rookies there were in the set because almost all the players in the 1960s had their rookie cards here in 1969-70. So by using the tall boys, they were able to use more real estate to make a card that stood out a little bit more distinctively, and they could play around with the border in a slightly better way. So these cards were right for kicking off this new era of cards, and really it was the era of cards for basketball. They did it again in 1970-71, so they had these 2 sets early on, and then they abandoned the tall boys completely. But as you got into the 80s and into the early 90s, card collectors were going back and looking at these old early basketball sets, which, since there were basically no fans for these cards, there weren't a lot of cards that existed, period. And there weren't a lot of people discovering these cards until the late 80s when the card industry was finally starting to grow for basketball. So you had a whole new market that was going back, looking at old cards and finding that 1969 was almost the starting point. And with rookie cards of Lou Alcindor and Wilt Chamberlain, it was a ridiculous set. So everybody really knew this, and the tall boys were famous really more for the basketball fan base rather than football. So this was really the sport where it would make sense to come out. It's just that nobody thought to sit down and make some new tall boys. That is until the NFL decided in 1992 to start a brand called GameDay. And here they dusted off their 1965 set, and they didn't use Topps. Topps was not interested in using the tall boys again, so it was the dimensions of the famed 1965 tall boy that GameDay was using. And they launched the set. It didn't work too well after 1 year, so they handed the card over to Fleer, and Fleer kind of jazzed the card up. They made it a little bit more exciting, got some inserts in there, and boy did they market this. They really pushed it out there. And they started to get the tall boy back into the American conscience. Fleer also had a presence in all the sports, so they were able to use this pretty much across brand. They started off with football, and then they expanded out after that. Now, if you're curious about all this, I've done a video on the tall boys, I've done one on GameDay, and I'll be doing a video on the power play and the extra bases, which is hockey and baseball. So those videos are out there if you're curious about it. It's basically a big family. The GameDay family is an interesting story in and of itself. But when Fleer kind of got their 93 set to work in football, they decided to expand out into hockey and into basketball. When they did this, they used different names. So their set for hockey was called Power Play. And for basketball, they went with Jam Session. For baseball, it would be Extra Bases, but there wouldn't be much of a story for that, or Power Play. But with Jam Session, the basketball set, there would be a long history. So the GameDay cards brought basically nothing from the old Topps cards. Same with the Jam Session. Jam Session cards were basically just early to mid-90s card designs. These were almost full bleed cards. They had a little border down at the bottom with the name, some stuff like that, but it was primarily just a picture. And this can be a little challenging in basketball if you don't select the images right. Fortunately, Fleer did that. Fleer did in fact choose the images really well, which they needed to do with this. The tall boy gives you a lot more real estate to really focus in on the vertical presence of the players on these cards. So that's the big strength that it has. In basketball, that's very much in tune. So there's a lot less of the background to kind of muddy up the player. So most of these cards come across as pretty good portraits, some more than others, but that was kind of the strength that it had. And they did a good job, not just with image selection, but also with enriching the colors, so the cards felt pretty dynamic. But also down at the bottom, the little border element, it has a good contrast of black versus a little bit of color band for the player's team, and this perfectly complemented the image to create a really well balanced card where you had just a little bit of detailing to kind of enliven the whole thing, but kind of get it out of the way. The card back, likewise, is primarily about the picture of the player. It is really well designed with a bunch of information on the back that's not really all that useful, but everything looks really good. The design approach for these cards is quite impressive. And the set isn't all that big. It's a pretty big size set, but it didn't commit the sin that GameDay did, which was they just had too many players, and so you kind of get lost in it. This felt like a pretty well balanced basketball set. But it was really about the inserts. That's always been what Fleer has been about. And they had 4 inserts for this set. The first one was Game Breaker. Now, Game Breaker here is kind of a psychedelic trip, which, let's face it, is a nice ode to a card that started out as a 1969-70 card. That's basically the time. So it's an ironic little twist. But it's basically a picture of the player completely dwarfed by this really overly colorful background with some oil and water effects, some computer generated effects, big mess of stuff. It's an okay card. It's not great, but it's an interesting card. The cards look great. The players don't look great on the cards. And the card backs, interestingly, for all of these sets, for all 4 sets, the card backs actually are done the exact same way as what they've done in football. They used different colors on the back, but it's basically the same card back design, even though the card front was totally different from football. Their rookie standouts are cards that are almost like they're designed by kids. I'm not a big fan of when they do this. They got color patches all over the place. And the big problem I have with these cards is that the players are in their college uniforms. And the problem with that is that they didn't have the rights, so they just airbrushed all the jerseys. And it's tough enough to see that with football. It's even more difficult for me with basketball because the jersey really is a significant part of what you're seeing, and so it looks really kind of fake. So that's kind of a problem that this set has, and it's too bad because we're talking about the rookies of Penny Hardaway, Chris Webber. It is a good rookie class. It's just that we didn't happen to get good rookie cards for these players. Fortunately, the second-year stars cards this is a lot better. These have a big rainbow pattern on the back, which does a really good job of not overpowering the player. It complements the player just right, so the card looks really classy, and the player is the point of the card. It still is the point of the card, which is, that's what these are supposed to be. So the player didn't get buried in the card, and I think that it's really good. It's strange that these inserts didn't do too well because the regular set cards are fantastic, but with these ones, they're a little bit limited. The last set is the Slam Dunk Heroes, and this again is a better card. This isn't quite as good as the second year cards, but it's still pretty strong because they actually at least have all the background image. They just kind of did an artistic approach to what was going on behind. So the player actually kind of fits in with the card back. So that reads pretty well. Now this is game day, and so there are a lot of different kinds of sheets. And the first kind of sheet I'm going to talk about is the night sheet. Now this is nothing unusual in basketball. Night sheets have been done for quite a while. The thing about a night sheet is it's basically a giveaway at an arena. So many of the teams it's not known whether all the teams had it. It's believed that not all the teams did have these, but it was a giveaway at an arena, so when you showed up, you got a sheet of cards. And the sheets are 16 panels. These are all perforated, so it has room for 16 cards. And any team that does not have all 16 of the players on here, or 15 players and the coach, and that's kind of a unique thing about this set is the coach. If they don't, then they actually have an advertisement of some sort on the sheet. So these night sheets there are a fair number of teams that have them, and so that is one of the ways that they came as sheets. But they also have their inserts in magazines, and these again are perforated. Now, the night sheets do not have any card numbers on the back, and that actually gives them the ability to make cards of players that didn't necessarily show up in the set. With these are numbered on the back. The inserts into the magazines are identical to the cards in the set. It's just that they're perforated. That's basically the only thing about it. But Fleer also really liked to do giveaways where they would, or promotions where they would do advertisements of all their brands. So in this case, they have their Fleer, they have their Ultra, and they have the Jam Session. And even in 1994, they did the same thing, Fleer and Ultra and Jam Session. So these different types of sheets were something that would pop up from time to time with the Jam Session cards, and it's kind of a cool thing that is a different aspect of collecting these cards. But again, this is basketball, and these kinds of things were pretty common in basketball. So that is out there just so that you're aware. Now, unfortunately, all of the other brands for the GameDay family would basically end in '94. Hockey wouldn't even make it to the year. Football had its last year, and baseball had its only year in 1994. But Jam Session was actually able to hold up and continue on past. So they were able to make their 94-95 set. Here, the card it's similar in that it's almost a completely borderless card. There's actually a little bit of black right down at the bottom. But these cards are really, really dark in comparison to the previous year. So 93-94, they were kind of bright, kind of like a skybox card. But in 94-95, they'd really darken these cards up. And the weight of that makes the cards not nearly as dynamic, but it makes the portraits a little bit more personal. So it's an interesting trade-off, but this is a set that really does you do feel the weight of these dark cards. And one of the problems that it has is that the player's name, etc., is little black boxes with team color text on top of it, which means that sometimes they just get buried into the card, and they certainly don't do anything to liven the cards up. So these cards are very subdued, and it's not really a benefit. The card backs also aren't really all that impressive. So why this card set got so dark, I really don't know, but it is a very heavy card design. And they came primarily in normal packs, but they also had kind of a McDonald's release. And I have to say, I don't know how this release happened. It's little packs of 3 cards, and they have a McDonald's card on the front where it's basically advertising the Jam Session. So I think that this was done at the actual venue for the Jam Session, the All-Star Weekend, but I don't know, and so I'd really like for somebody to let me know if you do happen to know where and when these were done, because I don't remember these myself, but it's packs that you can find from time to time. It doesn't appear that any of them came with inserts. It's just a couple of cards that show up in it, but it is one of the ways that it came. Now, the set itself this is like a mid-year release. This is not a late-year release. And because of that, they never did make a Michael Jordan card for this. Now, it's not that this is one of the rare sets Jordan didn't show up in, quite the opposite. Jordan didn't show up in that many sets in 94 and 95, but this is one of the sets where there is no Michael Jordan card. But the rookies do show up looking like they're players, just not in action shots. So for the inserts in this set, they have the same 4 inserts. They also have a 5th, but not all the 4 inserts came in the same way. So we start off with the Game Breaker, and the Game Breaker card here is a little bit better designed than in the previous year. Well, a lot better designed. And in this case, they just have a big image behind, which is pretty busy. It kind of convolutes the card a little bit, but not too much. But this is actually an embossed card. It's not a heavily embossed card. It's very lightly embossed. And the player has a glossy surface over him with a matte finish for the card back. So that was the first insert. The second insert set is the second year stars, and this is actually a horizontally oriented card, which is very unusual for GameDay. Here it's a big array of the same image scattered around. It's not an exciting card, but it's a really nice card. And again, these are some pretty good players. Chris Webber, Penny Hardaway, a good group. They also had their Slam Dunk Heroes, and this is actually an etched foil card. So it's kind of a dynamic card. It's not a really glossy and exciting card design itself, but it is a pretty good looking card. And so that's a fun card that they have. And then the last card, which is probably the card that has the most distinction to it, is Flashing Stars. And this is a Photoshop affair. Because of the black background and the colors, I think it stands out a little bit more than the Slam Dunk Heroes. It's just not as exciting. But the rookie standouts were not done as a regular insert in packs. They were actually done as a release from Fleer. So they came in complete set form, and this is a very well-designed card, a very formal card. It looks really good. Now, as far as special releases for cards, I want to note about something very significant about Jam Session. So Jam Session is a name associated with the All-Star Weekend, and Fleer had been a sponsor for that for a number of years, and they actually printed the tickets for the events, which gave them the ability to give you a preview card for the ticket stub on top. And so this is a pretty common thing that you'll run into, where you will have whether it's Ultra or in this case, when they did release Jam Session, using the Jam Session name for their cards, they were able to use the ticket stubs as an advertisement for the set proper. So you can find these, and for 93-94, they, instead of using the home team, so typically what they did was they made cards of the players who consider that stadium to be the home stadium for their team. So for instance, in 92-93's Ultra cards, that had been in Salt Lake City, so it was the Jazz. So in 93-94, these cards were for the All-Star Weekend that was happening in Minneapolis. And unfortunately, the T-Wolves, I guess, just didn't have very many players that they thought could really hold up. So instead, for the first Jam Session year, the ticket stubs that you find for that, those are all All-Star Game appearances. So you have Charles Barkley, you have Sean Kemp, you have David Robinson, Shaquille O'Neal, Scottie Pippen. These are the players who show up on these various ticket stubs. Now for 94-95, this happened in Phoenix, so that means that this is the Suns with Charles Barkley or with Kevin Johnson. For 95-96, that would be in San Antonio, so you're talking about David Robinson and Avery Johnson. These were the players that you'd see. These are the same card fronts, basically. The problem is that there is nothing on the back at all. These are ticket stubs, they truly are. So if you find a card that has nothing on the back, but it has just a perforation at the bottom, that's a ticket stub from the All-Star Weekend. They also did something interesting here between 94 and 95, where they wanted to create a game. And so this was a test set of cards for this game. You'll find they're very colorful. I really am interested to find out how the game was supposed to be played. To my knowledge, nobody's ever really found that out. It's never been, basically never been made public necessarily. So it's an interesting thing, but these cards also do exist. They're test cards, but they're in enough quantity that you can usually find some of them. So the 94-95 set was able to succeed well enough to justify making a 95-96 set. And for the set, Fleer decided to go with more of a mid-90s approach, where they were going to have a parallel version of all these cards that were die cut. So that was the thing. They started off with the mentality of these cards are going to be die cut. Thus, the card designs for the actual set are all die cut. And it's interesting what they came up with as a result. The cards are designed much more for kids, unfortunately. So it's an interesting approach they took with big, bright letters on the front that are almost cartoonish in a way. And up at the top, they have some interesting patterns. It's a two-tone pattern, and every team has the same colors, so it's continuous across all the teams, so they feel cohesive. But the patterns are basically kind of like a key, or it's like a diamond, or a little finial. It's a couple of different patterns that they have, 5 basically, that they repeat the pattern over and over again. So you don't have one team with all the same patterns. Most of the teams have different patterns that show up. And these are they're up at the top of the cards. They're just kind of dressing that show up on them. But it does make the cards kind of interesting. The card design itself is kind of blah, but it is interesting to see the die cut approach they had. The card back also is very forgettable. I mean, this was kind of like they were giving up in a way, which is a shame, because you look at that first set and it's great. And this set is a long distance away from it. But not all of the cards came this way. The 40 best players in the league were actually done in a different way, and they were done where the concept of how the die cuts were going to work, it ended up being almost like a game. So what they created were 20 pairs of players. Every one of these 40 players had a complement player, and they had the same color on each card. One had the die cutting on the top, the other had the die cutting on the bottom. And the normal cards look really clunky as a result. The cards also were designed with it's kind of a ghosted in background with a color fade in order to really emphasize the player himself. And they also did not do a two-tone for where the die cutting works. I'm not sure why, but the patterns themselves are really kind of intricate, because they wanted to make this like a puzzle. So you got to find, of all the 40 players, you got to find each of the 20 pairs. And I'm not going to go through all 20 pairs, but I'll show you a few. So you have Kevin Johnson and Mark Price. You have Michael Jordan and Grant Hill, Reggie Miller and Shaquille O'Neal, Chris Webber and Penny Hardaway, And sometimes the patterns can be a little tricky to see exactly how they line up, but it's fun to see these. But they also did something else that was kind of unique, where on the die cut cards they have some text. It's almost like somebody took a stamp and stamped it on the top. And the text basically gives you not a clue to who the other player is, but it's kind of like, it's basically like they're explaining what's the similarity between the two players. So in the case of Kevin Johnson and Mark Price, the Kevin Johnson card says, "These dangerous scoring threats also lead their teams in assists." The Mark Price card says, "Price isn't the only 6-footer who plays head and shoulders above the competition." So that's basically kind of the way that they did this. They themed it so that each pair of players, there's something distinctive about them. And with that little strip of text, it kind of ties them together, which is kind of a neat concept. But again, this is designed for kids, really. These cards are a world of difference from the 92 GameDay cards, which were designed for high-end collectors. Here they were just trying to get down to the bottom level and make these cards kind of fun and exciting, but these cards, the tall boys, were really tough to work with. Now they also had a Grant Hill Rookie of the Year card. This is an etched foil card, has no card number on the back, but that card does show up. Now, they don't have many of the insert sets that we're used to. So the first set is Fuel Injector, and it's not a bad card. They basically took the background and they made it kind of like a single color. They kind of ghosted stuff in. It's an okay card set, but this is very much the part of Fleer at its Photoshop best. They also had their Rookie Sensations, and this actually does look really good. This is basically cut out of a player with a big, bright, colorful background that reads really well with it, so it showcases the player really well. Not overpowering, it's a good balance. And they had their Showstoppers. This again is etched foil. This isn't quite as exciting as the Grant Hill card. It is kind of a boring card, but it's a very popular card because it's very rare, and it's got a Jordan in it. But the most common insert is the pop-ups, and the pop-ups are basically cards where there's some perforation and you can fold out the player from the back of the card, flip it around so that the player stands up like a little mannequin. It's kind of a fun idea. I don't have the heart to actually do that with any of my cards, so I haven't done it, primarily because I'm not sure where I would want to put the player. But that's kind of the idea of it. And so the pop-up cards, they're the most common of the inserts, and they also come with a bonus version. And the bonus version of the cards, or I shouldn't say a bonus version, but a bonus set of just 5 cards, it actually has gold foil for the player's first name. But those cards were pretty common, and these cards also have something significant because in 1996, Kellogg's decided to do a release in their Canadian packaging where they actually had miniature versions of these cards. Now they're the exact same proportions as the regular pop-up cards. So they're the tall boy proportions, but instead of being a normal card width and being extra tall, they're actually the normal card height, but they're narrower. And so these are miniature versions. On the front, basically the same. On the back, it just shows you how to turn it into a pop-up. But that was the only other release that they did for these, and it was something that was done kind of secondarily, and again, only in Canada. So that was Jam Session. That's what they did. Jam Session was the perfect name for Fleer to choose because Fleer was already using Jam Session. It was a big thing in their presence in the card market. It was a great thing to bring the tall boys back to basketball cards. And the 90s was the only time when tall boys could really make sense. So it was a fun thing, but it had a limited path. It only could last for so long. So this would basically be the end of the tall boy. And only recently have we actually seen the tall boy start to come back into existence. It's too bad that we don't really have a place for it, but we don't have the creativity that we used to have where things like this could actually have a strong presence. So, like I said, if you're interested in the tall boy story, I have a whole video on the tall boy story. If you're interested in GameDay or Power Play and extra bases, definitely check those out. Other than that, this is basically the story of the Jam Session cards. And let me know in the comments below what you think about these cards. If you've encountered them, you remember them from the past, if you're still really avidly collecting them. And definitely subscribe if you haven't done so. Check out my other videos. And thank you very much for watching.